Let us pray. Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, one of my absolute favorite podcasts is Revisionist History with Malcolm Gladwell. Now, here's what the short descriptor of the show says about it from the website. Revisionist history is Malcolm Gladwell's journey through the overlooked and misunderstood. Every episode re-examines something from the past, an event, a person, an idea, even a song, and asks whether we got it right the first time, because sometimes the past deserves a second chance. Man, when I first heard that, I was hooked from the start. I love history. I love Malcolm Gladwell's writing and his research. And hey, I also love second chances, right? Well, in the very first season, episode 8 was entitled Blame Game. Here's the descriptor. In the summer and fall of 2009, hundreds of Toyota owners came forward with an alarming allegation. Their cars were suddenly and uncontrollably accelerating. Toyota was forced to recall 10 million vehicles, pay a fine of more than $1 billion, and settle countless lawsuits. The consensus was that there was something badly wrong with the world's most popular cars. Except there wasn't. Blame Game looks under the hood at one of the strangest public hysterias in recent memory. What really happened in all those Camrys and Lexuses? And how did so many drivers come to misunderstand so profoundly what was happening to them behind the wheel? The answer touches on our increasingly fraught relationship to technology and the dishonesty and naivete of many in the media. How many of you remember hearing about that about a decade or so ago? I mean, I sure did. I'm not even a car guy. But you want to know what revisionist history found out? Here's the spoiler alert. There was nothing wrong with the Toyota cars at all. Absolutely nothing. It was, are you ready? User error. You'll have to go, especially if you love cars, you have to go and listen to that podcast for yourself to hear the details. But I was blown away when I heard it for the first time. Welcome to a brand new summer series entitled #Never Saw It Coming. Now, many of you know that I plan my sermon series 2 to 3 years in advance. And when I first put this series on the schedule, I wanted to tackle a number of biblical stories that had a twist, a surprising element to the story. Something that, as the title says, you never saw it coming. But then when I started doing research a month or so ago to pick the 4 stories for the series, a very strange thing happened. I found myself going back again and again to one particular book of the Bible, and that is the book of Judges. Now, the problem with the book of Judges is it has a pretty bad rap when it comes to the rest of the books of the Bible. I mean, one scholar commented that it seems to be the worst of what many people consider to be several bad Old Testament books because they're full of violence and war and killing, and God seems so wrathful and vengeful. I mean, look at some of the sermon series artwork that I found online that other pastors have used when they preached on the book of Judges. Judges, wicked people, gracious God. Scriptures, believe it or not, strange stories from the book of Judges. Flawed heroes, a study on Judges. Judges, broken heroes. Insufficient saviors. Don't judge me. Unfaithful. Breaking Bad, the flawed and the flawless in the book of Judges. And my personal favorite, the absolute worst Bible stories, what I learned while reading the book of Judges. Or you could just go Game of Thrones Iron Throne image, and most people will get the message, right? In short, writes J. Clinton McCann, the book of Judges seems to be an embarrassment to most church folk, and perhaps it is best passed over in silence. Well, when I was studying for today, it was McCann's commentary, however, that sold me on making this series entirely from the book of Judges. I mean, he went all Malcolm Gladwell on me, and he caused me to take another look at this misunderstood book with the bad reputation. In fact, he listed these following topics: tension and strife between rival groups, disputes over land and territory, uncertainty over the roles of men and women, power-hungry political leaders, child abuse, spousal abuse, senseless and excessive violence, male political leaders who chase women, excessive individualism, moral confusion, social chaos. Now, which time period do you think that he's referring to, right? This could be today, couldn't it? All of these things are relevant today, which is why McCann believes Judges may be, as he puts it, the most timely and relevant of all the books in the Old Testament for us to study. So here we go. We're beginning in the book of Judges, chapter 4, the first 3 verses. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. So the Lord sold them into the hand of King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and he had oppressed the Israelites cruelly for 20 years. Now, one of the patterns that we're going to see throughout the book of Judges, at least most of the book, is what biblical scholars have come to call the cycle. It works like this. The Hebrew people do evil by worshiping foreign gods. God, then frustrated at the people's faithlessness, subsequently allowed them to be oppressed by their enemies. And after many years of oppression, the people cry out to God for help. God hears their cries and raises up a deliverer who brings stability as long as he or she is still alive. But after that person dies, the people fall back into a life of idolatry and sin, and the cycle begins all over again. So right here at the beginning of chapter 4, we see evidence of the cycle, right? The prior deliverer, Ehud, has died, and the people fall back into a lifestyle of sin. Thus, God allows King Jabin of Canaan to rule over them. Now, the name Jabin means he will understand. It's sort of a bit of a sarcastic foreshadowing here, right? As the narrator is about to lay out a tale of how this king will come to understand just how God opposes oppressors. We're told that King Jabin and his right-hand man, General Sisera, had advanced military technology, 900 chariots of iron. Now, the Israelites wouldn't have chariots until King David's reign, some 200 years later. And the Canaanites had oppressed the Israelites for 2 decades. Finally, the people cry out to God for help, which means God is about to raise up a deliverer. But before we get to our heroine for today, let's spend a moment talking about the Canaanites. Now, the term Canaanites refers to anyone who was living in the land of Canaan. Now, it's a more of a geographic term than an ethnic one. Susan Nidich, in her Old Testament commentary on Judges, remarks that Canaan was never a single political entity, but they were comprised of various city-states living in this region. E. John Hamlin, in his book Judges, At Risk in the Promised Land, invites us to look at the Canaanites with a new lens. He writes this: Canaanites in Judges is a code word for those forces, structures, and individuals who were seen to be in opposition to the good order of Yahweh, of God. The real adversary was not a whole people, but a way of organizing society. Okay, so for 20 years, Canaanite oppression leads the people to finally cry out to God for help, and God hears their cries. Verses 4 and 5. At the time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came up to her for judgment. So the first judge in our #NeverSawItComing series is a woman named Deborah. Now, when we think of judges today, we think of people that are giving legal rulings. But in the book of Judges, the primary activity of judges is leading the Israelites against their oppressive enemies. You You see, the Hebrew word to judge means not only to judge in the narrow sense, but also means to establish justice in the broadest sense. One scholar suggested instead of calling them judges, we should instead refer to them as bringers of justice. I like that. As J. Clinton McCann puts it, they were persons entrusted with the enactment of God's will for the world. And we're starting the series with a woman. Rock on. Now, I know I just said that judges weren't legal experts, but Deborah is the one judge who actually functions in a legal capacity in the book of Judges. Sitting under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, Deborah is both helping the people with their legal matters as they come to her for judgments, but she's also functioning as a prophetess, meaning one who speaks on behalf of God. Verses 6 and 7. She sent and summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take position at Mount Tabor, bringing 10,000 from the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. And I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the Wadi Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand." So if Sisera is the famed general of Jabin's army, Deborah has just commissioned Barak to be her military leader. The Hebrew name Barak means lightning, and as Dr. McCann puts it, we'll soon discover that Barak seems, well, none too quick, brave, or brilliant. He needs that spark of Deborah to get himself going. Nevertheless, God has called Barak to bring the battle to Sisera, and Deborah the prophetess has relayed God's promised victory. Verses 8 and 9. Barak said to her, "If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." And she said, "I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." Then Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh. Well, the prophetess has just told Barak that God has already ordained his victory, but he says he won't go without her coming along for the ride. Dr. McCann notes that Barak is treating Deborah the way that other Israelites treat the Ark of the Covenant, right? That symbol of God's presence and power here on earth. He is not willing to move forward without her. Now, Susan Nidich remarks, this isn't a display of cowardice. On the contrary, you see, in the ancient world, the wise ones knew that victory comes with the presence of God's favorites. And evidently, Barak is none too worried about whose name gets shouted in the victory parade. Verse 10. Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 warriors went up behind him, and Deborah went up with him. Zebulun and Naphtali are two of the original 12 tribes of Israel. They were located, the 12 tribes, in geographic regions inside what they referred to as the Promised Land, or inside Canaan. A militia of 10,000 assemble under Barak's command, but they're going up against a professional, highly trained, and highly resourced army led by Sisera. 10,000 may sound like a lot, but compared to what they're fighting, it's not really. Verse 11. Now, Heber, the Kenite, had separated from the other Kenites, that is, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had encamped as far away as Elon Bezananim, which is near Kadesh. So consider this a bit of foreshadowing by our storyteller. There's two things that we're going to need to remember from this section. First, the name Heber the Kenite. He was an Israelite descended from Moses. But second, the city Kadesh, close to where Heber made his home, was a city of refuge, according to the book of Joshua, meaning that when someone committed a crime in ancient Israel, they could flee to that city. There were many of them spread out throughout the nation for amnesty. Now, on to that impending battle, verses 12 and 13. When Sisera was told that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera called out his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the troops who were with him, from Harosheth Hagoyim to the Wadi Kishon. So the Canaanite general hears about the Israelite militia mustering forces on Mount Tabor. He calls in his big guns, the 900 chariots of iron, plus all of the professional troops, and they get ready for what Sisera assumes will be another quick and easy battle. I mean, they've been doing this for 20 years, right? No big deal. Verse 14. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Up, for this is the day on which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. The Lord is indeed going out before you." So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 warriors following him, and the Lord threw Sisera and all of his chariots and all his army into a panic before Barak. Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot, while Barak pursued the chariots and the army to Harosheth Hagoyim. All the army of Sisera fell by the sword. No one was left. So Deborah, she's there at the battlefront with Barak. She gives him the word. This is the day that the Lord has given the enemy into your hands. And so with his militia behind him, Barak leads the troops into battle. Now, for 20 years, Sisera has had his way with the Israelites, but not today, Sisera. And the Lord threw Sisera and all of his chariots and all his army into a panic before Barak. Now, in chapter 5, we get a long poem known as the Song of Deborah, or in some translations, the Song of Deborah and Barak. Scholars believe this may be one of the oldest Israelite poems in all of the Bible. The song recounts the battle and its aftermath, and it contains details that aren't found in chapter 4, including the insight that God sent a rainstorm that made the battlefield too muddy for the Canaanite chariots to move, which then gave Israel the advantage. In the end, the narrator of chapter 4 tells us that all the army of Sisera fell by the sword and no one was left. And with that, the upset of the century, or at least the upset of 2 decades, was over. I mean, who would have thought that after 20 straight years of defeat, Israel would finally prevail over King Jabin of Canaan? But let me just say, this is not where our title comes in. This is not the hashtag never saw it coming moment of our story. No, for that, we must keep reading. Now, remember when Deborah first prophesied that Barak would lead Israel to victory, but he wouldn't get the credit. Instead, the credit would go to a woman? Well, you probably thought that Deborah was the woman who would receive the credit. And that very well could be the case, right? As she has an entire song penned in her honor in the next chapter. But that's not why I chose this story to start this series. Verse 17 to 20. Now Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite. For there was peace between King Jabin of Hazor and the clan of Heber the Kenite. Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, have no fear." So he turned aside to go into her tent, and she covered him with a rug. Then he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. He said to her, "Stand at the entrance of the tent, and if anybody comes to ask you, 'Is anyone here?' say no." Okay, there is a lot to unpack here. The heroine of our story is, or at least this part of the story, is a woman named Jael. Now, most scholars believe she probably wasn't Hebrew herself, but her husband, Heber the Kenite, remember him from a few verses back? He was Israelite. And even though King Jabin had made life miserable for the Israelites as a whole, he seems to have had a soft spot for Heber and Jael. Their tent was near Kadesh, remember, the city of refuge. So when General Sisera, defeated in battle and on the run, is looking for a place to hide, a place that is safe, Heber the Kenite seems to be the perfect solution. Only the narrator doesn't say anything about Heber the Kenite being home, does he? No, it's just his wife, Jael. And as we heard the story just read, Jael appears to be the perfect hostess, offering hospitality and grace to this, shall we say, friend of the family. But there may be more going on here than meets the eye. Dr. Victor Matthews, religious studies professor at Missouri State University, has an extremely insightful take on this encounter. He suggests that Sisera is actually up to no good. To start with, Sisera should have gone directly to Heber, the head of the household, not to his wife's tent. The actions insult Heber and they dishonor Yael. Yael would have known that something was out of the ordinary from the get-go. Next, good guests were not supposed to request things from their host, but Sisera does twice, right? Once asking for something to drink, and then again asking Yael to stand guard at the entrance to her own tent. And to top it off, he asks her to lie for him. Now, suggesting quite clearly that his presence is endangering the safety of his host, a major violation of the ancient Near Eastern customs of hospitality. In short, quite literally, Sisera is asking for trouble. Says Matthews, Sisera has systematically violated every covenant of the code of governing the actions between host and guest. Okay, so let's jump ahead to chapter 5 again. Remember the song of Deborah and Barak? And at the end of the song, we get a scene where Sisera's mother, right, the general, the commander of the army, his mom is wondering, hey, what's taking my son so long to return home from battle? Chapter 5, verses 28 to 30 says this. Out of the window she peered, the mother of Sisera gazed to the lattice. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why tarry the hoofbeats of his chariots? Her wisest ladies make answer. Indeed, she answers the question herself. Oh, are they not finding and dividing the spoil, a girl or two for every man? Did you catch that? Sisera's mom thinks he's delayed because he's probably partaking in the spoils of war, raping women of the people that they have just conquered, because that's what powerful warriors do after a battle. There's no doubt that Yael also knew this and that she had to have been on alert from the moment that Sisera came knocking. And what follows, some biblical scholars have argued, was proactive self-defense. Verse 21 and 22. But Yael, wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground. He was lying fast asleep from weariness, and he died. Then as Barak came in pursuit of Sisera, Yael went out to meet him and said to him, come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking. So he went into her tent, and there was Sisera lying dead with the tent peg in his temple. Hashtag never saw it coming, quite literally. Back in chapter 5, at the pinnacle of the Song of Deborah, we are told in verse 24, most blessed of women be Yael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, of tent-dwelling women most blessed. She is most blessed of women. She is the one the prophetess Deborah said would receive the glory for that day. And yet, there is still one more to receive glory. Back in chapter 4, verses 23 and 24, so on that day, God subdued King Jabin of Canaan before the Israelites. Then the hand of the Israelites bore harder and harder on King Jabin of Canaan until they destroyed King Jabin of Canaan. You see, ultimately it was God who had a hand to play behind the scenes in Judges chapter 4 and 5. And it was an unlikely trio that did, shall we say, the work of the Lord, right? A female prophetess, her lightning general, and a woman who was, well, let's just say handy around the house. Hashtag never saw it coming. That's what you can expect from this series over the next 4 weeks. But lest you think this was merely one isolated story in this crazy history of Israel, listen to how Dr. J. Clinton McCann concludes his discussion of this story. He writes, this episode in chapters 4 and 5 is not merely a local action against Jabin and Sisera. Rather, it is part of a larger trajectory that begins with creation, includes the Exodus, and later will include God's defeat of Israel itself when its own kings turn out to be oppressors like Pharaoh, Jabin, and Sisera. He's referring, of course, to the exile, a time when God allows foreign superpowers to invade and conquer Jerusalem, basically destroying the city and the temple. And for 70 years, the best and brightest of Israel are taken away into captivity 700 miles away to live an entire generation or two in a foreign land. But that's another story for another series. In the meantime, we'll be back in the book of Judges next week, a book that, as Malcolm Gladwell might say, is often overlooked and misunderstood. For it's a book that urges us to confront the challenging claim that nothing will be right with our individual selves, our churches, or our world unless we, the people of God, commit to steadfast loyalty to God and God alone. Along the way, I dare say, we might be shocked at how God remains faithful to a faithless people like us. I bet you'll never see it coming. I'm so excited. This is going to be a great series. Thanks be to God. Amen.